And I'm going to turn on transcription. See, we still have people rolling in, so I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we will kick us off.
Misty, will I be able to see all the audience members join?
Do you see the panel across the bottom? There is one that says participants.
Okay.
If you click that, and then you can see all, and you should see all the names.
Okay, I'm at full screen. I was just curious.
Okay. Currently we have 30, but they're still adding pretty quickly. Okay, we're at 1 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to get this party started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session today, including accessibility with diversity, inclusion, and equity within education. Before we begin, I wanted to cover some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. Please leave your cameras and microphones muted throughout the session. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat. Please use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of this session. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Eric Stano. Eric Stano is a Vice President of Consulting and Director of Content and Curriculum at Magic EdTech. As the VP of Consulting, he assists educational publishers and EdTech companies in achieving their growth strategies, transforming their businesses to harness the power of technology and manage change. As the Director of Content, Eric and his team develop and design digital content across an array of learners to help put academic success within reach of every student. And now I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Okay, thanks so much, Misty, and thank you all for joining today. A couple of remarks by way of a preamble. I sort of feel like I'm in a Venn diagram because I'm coming to you from Denver, the Accessing Higher Ground conference, and now I'm participating in this diversity and inclusion conference. So both of those two things in the form of a web or a Venn diagram really are part of the thesis that I'm making today of inclusion but not accessible. What I'm going to do is put forward some ideas for you all to consider, to think about how you might in your different lives converge those two streams, because my thesis in this whole thing is that there are sets of like-minded people in both cohorts that could both benefit from one another relative to their own strategies and what they want to accomplish. And there's some interesting things that have come out of the DE&I initiatives that I've seen that suggest that maybe accessibility isn't being included as fully as it could. That's certainly not true across the board, but there may be more that we can do. And this will be a slightly different session, I think, than some of the others you've participated in today. I've gone to a few of those, and they're really very, very substantive. I come from a slightly different angle. I'm not an educator, so I'll be talking from sort of what I see from my vantage point in the educational ecosystem. So bear with me, and hopefully if I stray across something where you have questions, I'll have the chance to answer them. Again, this is actually a version of the presentation I gave here at the Accessibility Conference, but just some mantras that we use to really drive us around the diversity, inclusion, and equity ideas. Diversity is the one true thing that we all have in common. Diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. And fairness does not mean everyone gets the same. Fairness means everyone gets what they need. And particularly in the education space, all three of these are important, but you'll hear me, at least in my voice, really stressing the equity, because at the end of the day, for students, it's about everyone having an equal chance to achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve and are being asked to achieve, frankly. So just a little bit of an agenda. I'll give you a little bit more information about who I am in addition to what Misty was saying. We'll define accessibility. DE&I, you all largely know, so I won't spend too much time defining it. That's the purpose of this conference, so everybody really knows what those letters stand for. And then I'll talk again from my vantage point about the emerging trends we see in both education and EdTech from my corner of the world. And then I'll make some suggestions for how we all might move forward together. I actually had a colleague who was going to join me today, but had to go back home. But again, I'm Eric Stano. I've been in higher education, product development primarily, although I've, in the last 2 years, have had a lot of experience in K through 12. I've been with companies like Wiley, Newton, an adaptive learning company, and Magic EdTech. About 2010, I took over at Pearson the developmental reading, writing, and math portfolios. Before that, I had been a political science editor, I'd been an English editor. But when I took over developmental reading, writing, and math, those sets of markets was what really put into sharp relief the diversity of the students that the users of my wares were facing, whether it was race, geography, socioeconomic status, cognitive and physical challenges, what have you. It made me realize that there were a lot of students who were in various ways on the bubble, and that it was my mission to help teachers and instructors achieve their mission of ensuring that all of these students could achieve. So that's kind of how I've gotten to a DE&I place as well as an accessibility place. And this is a joke that I won't bore you with, and I certainly will not demonstrate that karaoke is a great equalizer. Below me is Erin Evans, who is our accessibility expert. She is, again, not with me today. A little bit about who Magic EdTech is, so you have a sense of where I'm coming from. We're a digital learning product and platform company. Our passion is digital learning for everyone. We're a market leader in accessibility design, audits, testing. So one way to think about that, I think there are a lot of educators on the call here today, is that the products that you use, that you assign, that your districts or your schools bring in. What we do is, for the people who create those products, we help ensure that they're accessible. We define where the gaps are. We do some testing, and we also help them remediate. So that's just a little bit about where we come from. I actually joined Magic because of my DE&I sensibilities, because of accessibility, because we're so strong on accessibility. That felt to me always like a natural pairing. So that's part of the reason I'm actually at this company. We've been around for 30 years. We've contributed to 600 plus digital learning products. We're worldwide in our footprint. One of the things that may be of interest to folks in this group is that we have proprietary frameworks that help people from whatever they're trying to evaluate, whether it's curriculum, whether it's products. We can help you. We have frameworks that guide us in consulting on where there might be some gaps relative to DE&I, where you can fill those gaps, how you can fill those gaps. And again, like with accessibility, we can provide the resources to help you do that. But ultimately, our vision is, allowing for humanity's pursuit of happiness by making lifelong digital learning accessible, affordable, and sustainable. So that's enough about Magic. All right, let's talk a little bit about these converging streams that I'm hoping that we can all think about and perhaps pursue if everyone agrees that it's profitable for both cohorts to do that. Relative to accessibility, again, I'm sure most of you know this, so I am a little shy about providing definitions because I don't want to tell you things that you already know, but accessibility, the quality of being for any product, any content, the quality of being easy to approach, reach, enter, speak with, use, or understand, being usable, reachable, obtainable, the quality of being suitable or adapted for use by people with disabilities. What I'll be talking mostly about today is relative to web accessibility, which means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And more specifically, what being accessible means is that people can read, understand, navigate, and interact with the web and contribute to it as well. Again, this is stuff that you probably all know, but what's required from the vantage point of educators or institutions or districts or classrooms. Federal funds are used for curriculum purchases and to adhere with ADA, Section 504, Section 508, WCAG 2.2, now it's forthcoming, and making reasonable accommodations. Again, folks on this call probably know this better than anyone, classroom management, being able to differentiate and individualize instruction. It's not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. Access to assistive technologies, and having disability services department ensuring that facilities and programs meet accessibility requirements and are supporting students, faculty, and staff. From, again, my corner of the world and those who create the products that you all use, it's to make sure that we're meeting the market requirements, creating and distributing educational materials that align with the WCAG 2.2 standards. We're not quite there on 2.2, but it's forthcoming. And just a glimpse on how EdTech companies, those people who are creating products, as well as my own company, try and take a holistic focus on accessibility, remediating. This is actually what a lot of companies have been immersed in for some time, remediating existing products to improve the user experience. Accessibility for many years was sort of an afterthought in product creation, and a lot of companies are going back to ensure that they are more up to speed relative to accessibility, creating new products that are born accessible. That's a philosophy that my company happens to have, and a lot of other companies subscribe to that. Training our teams internally and externally on accessibility best practices, and providing accessibility statements relative to websites, as well as policies for your company itself. Now here's where I'm really shy about trotting out definitions. These were purloined from one particular site, although refereed internally. But again, these are things that what is diversity? It's the presence of the differences that may include a variety of things. And this is not comprehensive: race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, disability, a religious commitment, political perspective. I didn't deliberately skip over all those words, but I didn't want to blather at you too much. But diversity is really the numbers, who's in the group. Inclusion is an outcome to ensure that those peoples from the diverse groups actually feel welcomed. So there's a proactive leaning in on the part of any organization, institution, classroom, what have you. And equity, and this is again where I really try and lean in, is ensuring that everyone is promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness with regard to procedures, processes, and distribution. This is really ensuring that every student has an equal opportunity to succeed and does not have blockers that really shouldn't be there relative to what we're talking about today, relative to the experiences of those people who are in diverse groups. And again, this is really the point of this conversation today, is looking at, where is accessibility relative to DE&I considerations, and how might we go about converging those streams. And this is sort of a seminal, I don't know if folks on this call will know Sherry Ebert's, certainly here at the Accessing Higher Ground conference. They all do. And this was what really began to animate me and my colleague, Aaron, to begin promoting this through talks like this and agitating for the convergence of the two streams. There was a blog that Sherry wrote, and within that, I made this the title, but it was buried within her blog post. Can you enable the captions, please? And she was participating in a DE&I training session, and they had failed to put on the Zoom call. And what that led to was taking a bunch of steps, gobbling up meeting time, feeling a little bit awkward, creating a little bit of sense of embarrassment for her, all because these people committed to diversity, equity, and inclusivity just hadn't widened their perspective to think about accessibility as part of that very conceit. So as you see here in the bullets, they struggled to enable the captions, and again, they just hadn't really thought about it. Not out of any malice. It just wasn't something that they hadn't considered as part of a DE&I themed meeting. So this was always sort of my linchpin within this conversation of why this kind of thing is important. Just a glimpse, again, from the perspective of the companies that are providing you with the products that you're using in classrooms, et cetera. They have begun in the last 24 months to really pursue this themselves. They understand the importance of it. They subscribe to the principles themselves. It's an authentic thing that is happening here. And I thought it might be interesting to share with you some of the principles that have been codified from an educational product company. In this case, they were targeting higher ed, but it really doesn't bifurcate, in my experience, that massively. You know, a respect for human rights and create content that is free from discrimination and bias. Develop content that embeds commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Provide support for learning that is based on evidence and facts. Create content that is ethical and adheres to legal requirements. The sound familiar, an opportunity and alliance, I left that in, although that was targeted at the accessibility community. These are principles that they share, which is why I think there's a lot that both communities could learn from one another in a variety of ways. Again, just the principles tend to then drift down to criteria that these companies hold. I thought it might be interesting for you to see those, ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to succeed through learning, develop products and services that represent the rich diversity of learners, evolve that any content offered by the institution towards anti-racism and social justice, and ensuring that any institutions and any organizations own employees feel a sense of belonging both on campus, within their communities, or within their workplace. Again, this comes from a higher education publisher, and I appreciate the fact that they're not only putting this forward toward their customers, teachers, instructors, students, they're turning it back on themselves, which to me suggests some level of authenticity in the endeavor that they're undertaking. Again, this was pointed, and I'd be interested in any comments that folks have, but this is from data that I've mined. And I think most folks would agree, you know, now more than ever, institutions, school districts, certainly industry, are advancing diversity, equity, inclusivity issues more vigorously. Chief diversity officers, certainly within organizations, often within higher ed, are relatively new. An interesting reflection on this, again, this has taken off really in the last 24 months, or certainly has accelerated from you know, my point of view. But there has been some talk of, you know, there was a lot of commitment to, you know, racial justice, which is absolutely appropriate and necessary and should be, you know, certainly privileged. But the focus often doesn't widen as much as it should beyond that for other groups that also, you know, deserve an equal opportunity to succeed. An interesting thing, a lot of conversations around this, and it's something that I tend to raise, is the question of what should you be doing to measure your success relative to implementing diversity, equity, inclusivity, as well as with accessibility. How do you measure that you've been successful? A side story here, I attended the book industry study group, sort of just education publisher luminaries of sorts. They were all in this meeting discussing diversity, equity, inclusivity. I looked around, it was a sea of older white people, with the exception of the NYU students who were bringing everybody coffee. That was a diverse group, and everybody was talking, you know, sort of very in the right sorts of terms relative to DE&I, and they were talking a lot about representation. It was all very well-meaning and principally minded. What I kept doing was asking the room, how are you going to measure that you've been successful in making this change. Certainly with students, there could be some longitudinal studies of whether more students are succeeding and achieving the outcomes, et cetera. But I think perhaps more people can be thinking about how we measure the changes that we implement. And again, that goes to both DE&I and accessibility. I thought this might be an interesting reflection, pulling it out of the education space for a second, again, because companies are moving in this direction, but the gaps, I think, are illustrative. 81% in one survey of companies reported that they believe in DE&I initiatives, but only 34% of the respondents said that they had they had enough resources. They needed better access to leadership and to funding. And although organizations are making commitments to DE&I, they aren't making it a strategic priority. 63% of companies are hosting DE&I related discussions, but only 50% of them actually have a mission statement, which is someplace that you want to start, I would think. And fortunately, more organizations are investing in DE&I staffing. But an interesting, data point on that is that 80% of DE&I roles at least within industry, I don't know if this is inclusive of education, have been hired in the last 24 months, meaning a lot of companies are just beginning their change journeys. So this is, from a DE&I perspective, an alliance with the accessibility community. There are opportunities therein because the accessibility community has really been forming over the last 30 years since ADA was signed. So there may be lessons learned, standards to which we can measure progress or adhere. There's a lot, I think, that the new DE&I initiatives and commitments can likely learn from, again, a cohort of very like-minded, principled people. All right, so another nice quote. Just some reflections on uncovering opportunities to connect these two groups better. Again, this is not true in every case. In fact, at this conference that I'm at, several people raised their hands and gave us some information on their own institutions and how, in fact, the accessibility office exists within the Office of Equity, which I considered a good sign. That was a new innovation for them, but people are beginning to move on this front. But again, disabled voices are not often included in DE&I conversations. DE&I credentialing does not include accessibility topics. Again, this isn't pasting everybody with the same brush, but just some trends that we've seen. Some DE&I websites are not accessible. That's just simply a fact. And again, accessibility, we would argue, I would argue, is part of inclusion. If you're not accessible, you're excluding some people. DE&I and accessibility policies are separate, probably necessarily so right now, because DE&I is newer in terms of being a codified sort of muscular initiative and strategy and commitment. But in curricula, DE&I does not include people with disabilities. In corporate policies, DE&I does not specify people with disabilities. So it'd be interesting to reflect on your own school, your own district, your own institution, your own workplace. Should that be different, and see where you stand. And certainly within the educational space, in curricula, focusing on the efficacy is what, at the end of the day, this is really what we're all about. We want every student to have that opportunity to succeed. We want it to be, an equivalent access to opportunity. And that goes for all the DE&I considerations you've been discussing today, and that I discuss in my own life, as well as the accessibility strategies. If the end user is successful, efficacy is achieved, and everybody wins. Okay, so some ideas. I will admit that they are sort of ephemeral, nebulous ideas at this point, and part of the point of this entire session was to sort of just put the thinking in your heads if it's not there already, and begin to think about whether it would be beneficial to both groups to promote partnerships, connect with people with disability, connect people with disabilities to DE&I advocates, invite yourself to the table. From the accessibility angle, what I heard a lot of here was that they were inviting themselves or asking for a seat at the table with the new DE&I initiatives that were beginning to form on their campuses or wherever. And they were finding success. They were finding they had a voice, and they were finding that they could contribute to the efforts as well. Also, take small steps, use inclusive language. Here again, this is targeted at a little bit more of an accessibility side, but in DE&I, keep any social media posts or what have you, keep the community with differing abilities in mind, and ask questions. Embrace those around you. And one of the things that I have, I see somebody's raising my hand. So Misty, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to stop talking. I want to be respectful.
Please continue. We will answer questions at the end.
Okay. Lost my train of thought for a moment. Brace those around you. Oh, this is the point. And this is one that I've taken to the accessibility communities while agitating for them to engage with the DE&I communities, asserting that they deserve to be there, and saying that there's stuff you can contribute to their own nascent efforts, but then helping them recognize that they can benefit from DE&I principles and awareness, because they themselves, the disability community is not a monolith. There are multitude of differences. People are different races, different geographies, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses. There's a lot that both sides can contribute to one another. And what can you do? Just some vaguely concrete ideas. Keep the conversation going. We have a collaborative conversation that is on LinkedIn currently, so you are invited and welcome to contribute to that. Hashtag digital learning for everyone. Engage with your colleagues in social media. Do what you can, advocate and educate. And there are some resources, again, relative to actually to accessibility that might be interesting for you to look at. If the idea of including accessibility in DE&I is something that's on the newer side, or it's widening your perspective at all. And I'll conclude with just a Maya Angelou quote that my colleague and I both love. Do your best, do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. So with that, I think we have time for some questions.
Wonderful. That is one of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, by the way. Gloria said she's glad that you touched on the subject, that it has to be more than just knowing that inclusion is the right thing to do. There has to be action after the conversation and ongoing growth, which is super relevant to the quote that you just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you.
So if we have other questions, please put those in the Q&A, or if you would like to speak, you could raise your hand, and I'm pretty sure I have the ability to unmute so that you can verbalize.
And I think this only goes one way, but because I'm in a conference hotel with terrible internet, I may have to ask Misty to, or somebody else to repeat their question, because people will occasionally blink out mid-sentence on me.
Absolutely. While we're waiting to see if more questions come in, I would like to hear a little more about your question on how do you measure if you've been successful in reaching the DEI end goal or the immediate goal. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, that's and I often preface this kind of talk with this will be irritating because I'm going to make assertions and not have the answers for you. And so the simple answer is I don't know how you measure success. I think when it comes to there are people far smarter than me that can probably divine that if you have a cohort of students and you begin implementing DE&I, being able to sort of measure that impact longitudinally relative to outcomes. If you've had these success metrics in place without the DE&I policies implemented, and then you do measuring that success, and I know statistically it's more complicated than what I'm saying here, but because I'm focused on education, that's how I really think about it. When I raised that point at the book industry study group, I was a hair's breadth away from saying, well, you can measure your success in greater distribution of your products for education. That may be one way to measure once you've done it. So you have a vested interest in doing this, even from a business imperative perspective. But I think it's measuring success and just figuring out the right metric that you want to measure. And I always go to student outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And also, slicing and dicing some of those outcomes relative to different groups. Was a particular cohort not succeeding at X point in time, and then later they began succeeding because they could see themselves in the material. The questions were unbiased. The technology being used took into account their own broadband or their own technical, their socioeconomic background, whether they had access to computers on a daily basis. All of those sort of considerations come to mind.
Absolutely. And I love your point too about making sure that our individuals with disabilities are at the table, so they have a voice at the table where we're having discussions and action items and outcomes are being decided upon.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Eric? Okay. Jason says it's hard to get people to think about those who interact differently with the world. Any suggestions on how to get the conversation started? Great question.
How they interact differently. I'm not sure. I want to answer it wisely and directly to your point. So are you suggesting, Jason, that people are just unsure if they're encountering somebody with disabilities in a variety of different ways, how they go about approaching that and advice relative to that? Is that how maybe you understood the question, Misty?
Yeah, I think it is more about how do we get like the courageous conversations going? How do we have the conversations about how to interact and include these individuals?
Yeah, I think being at an assistive conference right now, one of the things that I do hear is they're people, they're regular people. They have this, that, or the other thing that they grapple with in their making their way in the world. But they're and actually I've really been gratified because I had not been to assistive technology conferences before. This was much more my colleagues' remit, but because we've joined forces, this is my second one, and I've been here for days and interacting, cocktail parties, presenting, listening to presentations, and it's one of those mindsets where you see everyone has common ground. Everybody is trying to make their way through the world, and just because they have a seeing eye dog doesn't mean they're not brilliant or funny or engaged or what have you. It's just this is a terrible answer, Jason, but I think it's just a mindset of recognizing that we're all humans at the end of the day, and we're all trying to make our way through the world, and it can feel uncomfortable at first. Talking with a blind person who's not looking directly at you, their head is angled in a different direction. But I went to a consortium last night, and there were several blind people in the room who were just brilliant and whip smart funny, and and also would joke about the fact that they didn't pick up any of the behavioral cues that we were done at that moment listening to them talk. They had concluded their point and they were going on a little bit longer, but they laughed about that. They made that joke. So I think what separates us is there's not as much as what pulls us together.
Mm-hmm. Shonda asks, DEI has been a concept that has been around for a while, and adding accessibility makes sense, becoming DEIA. We currently have momentum in this area. How do we continue to build on this, especially if and when we start losing steam in that area?
Yeah, I think that the biggest piece of advice that I've given is for those who are driving the DE&I conversations, if you're beginning to consider bringing accessibility into it, which I hope that you do, most institutions, schools, districts have an accessibility department. I know that from the fact that, my products when I was at Pearson had to get approved by them to even be considered. Also, that department will handle accessibility conceits on campus. I would simply take leadership from the DE&I community and approach the accessibility folks and say, hey, you've probably heard that we're working on these things. We have been for a while. It makes sense to us to combine forces. Should we talk about that? What can we do? What can we learn from you? What can we teach you? And I think I had two examples, so not statistically significant, but I had two examples of that going in the opposite direction. An accessibility person making room for themselves at the table in the DE&I conversations. They literally traveled over to that department and opened that conversation. Oh, Misty.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you blinked out there for a second. So if you could speak again.
The last question currently on the books, what are your thoughts about universal design?
Nothing more than I think it's necessary. I don't think I have anything more savvy or insightful to say about that. It's just a common, it's almost, when I said we think about products as born accessible, universal design is just a must when we're creating anything.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that's not. I didn't just dump a lot of wisdom on you there. I'm just like, yes,
do it
for it.
Do universal design. Yeah, it's not a new concept, but it is to some.
Yeah.
I want to give just another minute and make sure there's no more questions. Got some amens and yeses in agreement.
Oh. Nice to hear.
Okay. Well, we would like to thank you all for attending and participating in the Including Accessibility with Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity session in higher ed. We hope that you will enjoy the remainder of your session. You can leave this session and go back to the lobby to join the next session, which will start at 2 o'clock. Thank you again so much, Eric. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Misty, and thank you all for showing up. I hope you got something out of it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.